I'm going to be talking mostly about costuming from a LARP designer perspective. I'm the head aesthetic designer for Event Horizon. It's a blockbuster LARP, and it's a LARP where all of the adults are costuming themselves at home. So I'm used to a summer camp environment where I, as a costumer, costume 60 children at once, and I get to make sure the PC groups look coherent. I get to do the overall aesthetic of the game. I get to make sure that all of them look consistent, that you can tell, oh, those are the monks, and oh, those are the warriors. I get to make sure that all happens for them when I'm costuming them as groups. When I was moving into blockbuster LARP and moving into all of these adults are going to be out here costuming themselves. How do I, as a designer, create looks that they can emulate, that they can do at home, and also looks that are going to indicate what their alliances are, what their jobs are, what their groups are, and indicate our setting. We're a sci-fi setting that is kind of space opera-y. It takes place over 6 homeworlds and various colony planets. So I'm looking at fashion and sci-fi, but also I'm looking at a lot of diversity in aesthetic. I need people to be able to indicate through fashion what planet they're from and be identifiable. But also, it's okay, I need to indicate that I'm from Barrios, but I need to indicate that I'm also a reporter. And how do I make it possible for players to do both of those things at the same time? So what I started doing is designing these aesthetic posts for players. I'm going to show you one right now. This is Dawnlighters, which is a religious group. This post is a combination of reference images, text, logos I designed for it. I make Pinterests for all of the groups that usually have high fashion inspirations. And then I also make polyvores for all of the groups that have more affordable, what you're going to easily be able to find in stores, options for buying clothes in that aesthetic. So I'm also big on tying costuming into world building. And when you're looking at it from a designer perspective, when you're doing it as a player, you're like, all right, how do I look at the world building that's already happened and bring my costume to that world? When I'm doing it from a design perspective, I modify world by the aesthetics I create. I always talk about why different materials are common on this planet. I think about class a lot when I'm designing aesthetics. So certain planets, only high-class people would have access to things like leather. Certain planets only, it would be a lower-class material because that means that you're farming and using your own animal skins. When you're thinking about access to resources, that influences aesthetic. When you're thinking about what is valued in that culture, that influences aesthetic. So a lot of times I start with oh, this is a cool thing I'd want to wear, and it feels right, and then I go back and I'm like, how does that connect to the world? What implications does that have about the world, and what is it going to influence out from there? So this is looking at space station and military fashion. I was thinking about how military fashion would change when you're not doing military combat on planets, when you're doing it all in space. And therefore I was thinking about what would be the easiest uniforms in space, and I landed on white. When you are planet-side fighting, it makes sense to have camos, it makes sense to blend into your environment. If you're fighting in a spaceship, you want something that you can throw it all in the wash together and bleach it, and it's going to be clean for your whole crew, right? So I think it's really fun and interesting to have that conversation between aesthetics and world building. And I'm lucky that with Event Horizon, I'm in a position to do that. And then there's the matter of presenting that information to your players, right? So I design all of these things, and then I have individual blog posts. Right now they're on Tumblr. We're moving them over to our website as soon as I have free time. So the posts consist of, again, like a lot of high fashion reference images, descriptions of how the aesthetic ties into the world building, and then practical advice on how to achieve those specific looks. So it's like, I talk a lot about fit, I talk about what kind of fabrics are going to fall the way that you want, as well as like, I do talk about world building, what materials will be used, but I also talk about how you can fudge it. Like, you don't need, I'll be like, oh yeah, this planet, they use a lot of like natural fibers. You don't have to do that, you can fudge it, use a blend, it'll be cheaper, but it's gonna still fall the right way, you know? And looking at fabric texture. So like for Space Station, I'm like, cool, I don't expect you guys to buy these like weird, like avant-garde designer things that are like inspirations for me, but you can look at them and be inspired by them, and here are things that I found that are more affordable that have similar lines, have similar cuts to them. So, yeah, so we're also talking about designing a ton of different aesthetics for this world and making them all distinct and recognizable, and giving players enough space to play and find their characters within each of those aesthetics. So the two we just last saw were a religious group and a military group, and this one is one of our planets. This is the planet Gear, and then we did New Gear fashion. Gear is a planet based around sailing, primarily. It's like a water-based planet with a lot of like islands, and a lot of their culture was based around traveling over the ocean, warfare by ship, fishing, and migration. So one of the things that I took was I took a big inspiration from Sailing Not Work. And I was like, cool, this is my inspiration point for this, and how am I going to incorporate that into the fashion and make that recognizable? And also make it accessible, because again, I love high fashion. I make Pinterest boards for all of these. I can't afford high fashion. I'm thrifting. I'm looking at like whenever there's a sale at stores I like.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be expensive to look expensive.
Oh no, totally not. But yeah, it also, actually this one is a good place to also talk about the interplay of character and costume that I try to foster. Because I try to give people a way to connect their costume to their character's culture. But I think about designing costumes in two ways when I'm costuming myself, and I want to give people the opportunity to also do that. I think about what's going to make my character look and read to other people, like Raquel was talking about, and I think about what is something that makes me feel like I'm embodying my character. And for me, those are often wildly different things. For Gira fashion specifically, I had something built in. This planet was destroyed, and most of the people in game are a diaspora. So what I incorporated is, since they were already a nomadic culture, having a tradition of carrying small bottles of soil of your home island. And like wearing that as jewelry. So I had that. It's there's a description of it here. There's like little bottle pictures over there of things that you can do. I had that because I knew that if I was thinking about playing Gira character, having something like that would be a focus piece for me. That wouldn't be flashy, it wouldn't be super noticeable by other characters, but like in a quiet moment, it's something like that I could feel like hanging around my neck, or that I could like rub my hands over. And like incorporating small parts of your costume to ground you in your character can be super powerful. It can allow you to be in character even when you're alone, which is honestly some beautiful, quiet times that happen in LARP.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, but then, yeah, you also want to externalize parts of your character. It makes your character recognizable. It also indicates, it lets people know certain things about your character right off the bat. Maybe you have to decide when you're building a costume what you want people to know about your character. For some people, it's home planet first and foremost. For some people, it's their job. Status is conveyed via costuming. If you are rich or poor, and how you carry yourself can all be aided by costuming. Sometimes when I play really high status characters, I want to wear something that's tight on my shoulders because I know it makes me have my shoulders back and I can feel it the whole time and I'm conscious of it. And also like thinking about, I'm designing aesthetics for a world that doesn't exist, right? But you also have to think about what modern indicators we have and what modern notions attached to things are going to carry through subconsciously. A suit jacket, if it's like well tailored and stuff, is still going to carry status no matter what setting you're in. So while suit jackets might not be my favorite like sci-fi look, if I'm looking to play like high-powered corporate and evil, that's still something I'm going to look at to draw from because people already have that association there. And if my costume is going to start getting across my character faster, if I do that, it's maybe worth it to make that decision for my costume. So I like color theming groups. It can be, listen, I started out in LARP summer camp. With kids, you're just like, all right, you're all green and you're all red, and now you know which adult you're supposed to be following around because you're wearing the right tunic. It's still super helpful with adults to immediately be able to look at someone and be like, oh yeah, you're part of the private security team. Oh yeah, you're part of, I don't know, the Gira Cultural Center. Like, color is such a strong, immediate visual indicator. It really, really is. So let's see if I can find a list. Yeah, I include color schemes, suggested color schemes, as part of all of my fashion group design. And since it's for adults, they're designing their own costumes, it's not just one color, but I try to have colors that have like a similar feeling to me, a color scheme that works well together, that people can pick and choose and draw from, and hopefully it'll still create some group cohesion there. Because yeah, I'm looking for group recognizability and from a designer standpoint, and then I'm looking for people to come in and show me something about their character, and then hopefully have something personal for their character as well. It's like a fun combination. Yeah, people have already talked a lot about this. I feel like I'm maybe a middle ground as far as like practicality on costuming here.
Don't follow me. I'm bad.
I mean, I'm also a cosplayer, so I do that for cosplay. I do not do it for LARP because I know myself, and if my shoes are pinching, I'm going to be focusing on that and not on my character. Shoes is the #1 thing I recommend you sacrifice.
Yes.
First thing you sacrifice for your aesthetic, shoes. Wear comfortable shoes. I tell my players this all the time. I'm like,
So true.
listen, I want you to look good. I did all these posts, I did all this design because I'm invested in you looking good. If your shoes are ugly, and that's gonna make it so that you can walk this mountain, that's what I want. Like, way more than you look having cute shoes. It is definitely like, especially because I LARP a lot outside, like balancing comfort and practicality and the aesthetic and the look is super important. And as a game designer, you want to be giving your players advice on that. You probably have more experience with your land and environment than they do. And also in a creative fit and frenzy, they will forget. And yeah, it's nice when if you remind players to bring jackets so they don't show up at costuming during the weekend being like, I'm freezing. I'm like, that's real, but common sense. Common sense before the look sometimes. So yeah, reminding your players to consider their own comfort and also reminding them of the physical requirements of the LARP and the way that your land is a great thing to do as when you're thinking about costuming for your event. And if you have an event that's going to be colder, in-character outer layers, especially like warm winter coats and stuff, can be super, super difficult to find, especially on a budget. The thicker fabric is and like the actually warmer it is, usually like that ups your price point. So if you're doing outdoors, winter, or late fall cold stuff, you want to be making sure you're getting advice to your players about that really like way far in advance. You want to make sure if they're playing outside and they want to be in costume outside, that they're thinking about warm outer layers. Definitely a thing I've had problems with. Oh yeah, I'm also going to take a brief segue into gendered costuming for your LARPs because, you know, I'm the queer forever. I think it's super important to design around to include a variety of gender presentations in your costuming as a LARP organizer and designer. For Event Horizon, it's easier than historical because we are looking at a future with a myriad of gender presentation differences. Clothing is by default gender neutral in this setting. In my like perfect fantasy ideal, clothing is actually perceived by players as gender neutral when you're in this game. It's not possible. It's not because people are, again, bringing in their preconceived notions of what indicates gender and what clothing is gender. So you have to design with that in mind as well. But also, like, I super strongly encourage, like, in your examples of fashion, mixing it up with gender. Like, skirts and dresses, especially, men can wear them. Make settings where it's socially acceptable for men to wear skirts and dresses. It can be super great. In the future, there is absolutely, in sci-fi, why would that be a gendered item of clothing anymore? There's not really a great reason. And when we're looking at fantasy too, robes, guys, those are just dresses. They really are. We put kids in dresses all the time, and these little boys will be like, I don't want to wear a dress. We're like, oh, it's okay, it's a robe. And they're like, oh, okay, like Gandalf, I'm set. And it's easier with kids. It's about recontextualizing, and even when you're designing for adults, as a designer, you can start doing that work to recontextualize clothing and the way clothing is gendered for your game. And yeah, clothes are fun. I don't see a lot of like clothing design docs or costuming tips beyond like high fantasy, sci-fi, dystopian for a lot of games, and I would really love to see more of it. As game designers, don't dive deep into your aesthetics. Aesthetic design can be a great way to reinforce themes in your game, to set tone, and it's super fun. It's really fun. I think that like at the end of the day, costuming it's not an essential part of LARP. You can LARP in feeder blacks, you can LARP in a fucking nerd t-shirt, it does not matter.
It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
costume for you.
For me though, like, costuming is essential to life for me.
Same.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I understand that for people it's personally important.
Yes.
It's personally important to me because I love it. But I think it's like, as a designer, I want it to be something that we play with more instead of something that we are like, players will figure that out. Because it is really fun, and I do feel like it's yeah, this fun aspect of LARP instead of like a chore or a huge like monetary investment and burden.
And that's